Gardner jolted awake to the sound of his son's soft breathing beside him. The room was dark, the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the cracked blinds of the tiny apartment they called home. The air was cold, the kind of chill that settled into the bones of those who couldn't afford heating. He pulled the thin blanket tighter around Christopher Jr., his heart heavy with the weight of another uncertain day. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake his son. The worn-out mattress creaked beneath him, a stark reminder of how fragile their life had become. Bills were stacked high on the cluttered nightstand, unopened envelopes filled with demands he couldn't meet. The rent was overdue, the landlord's warnings growing harsher with each passing week. There was never enough money, never enough food, never enough sleep. Chris ran a hand over his tired face, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. He had been working 2 jobs, one as a medical equipment salesman and another doing odd gigs whenever he could find them. But no matter how hard he pushed, he was always a step behind. His dreams of financial stability, of giving his son a future worth fighting for, felt like a distant mirage, flickering just out of reach. Still, he couldn't let go of the vision he had for his life. He wanted to be a stockbroker. He had seen the men in their tailored suits, striding through the financial district with a confidence that seemed foreign to him. They had everything he didn't: money, connections, power. But what if he could change that? What if he could break free from the cycle of struggle and carve out a life beyond mere survival? Reality, however, was unforgiving. He had no degree, no financial background, and no one willing to take a chance on a man with an empty resume and a son to care for. The dream seemed impossible, yet it burned within him, refusing to die. The breaking point came when the eviction notice was finally taped to their apartment door. Chris had known it was coming, but seeing those cold, printed words sent a wave of panic through him. He had nowhere to go. His savings had long since dried up, and every friend he had was either in their own struggle or unwilling to take in a man with a child. That night, Chris held his son's hand as they walked through the dimly lit streets of San Francisco. His heart pounded with anxiety, but he forced himself to stay calm. Christopher Jr. looked up at him with innocent trust, unaware of the storm raging inside his father. They ended up at a subway station, the cold tile floor offering no comfort. Chris sat against the wall, cradling his son in his arms, his jacket the only barrier against the chill. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had to be strong, for his son, for himself. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Maybe he was chasing an illusion. Maybe some dreams weren't meant for people like him. But just as despair threatened to swallow him whole, fate intervened. The next morning, as Chris made his way through the city, he saw a sleek red Ferrari pull up to the curb. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, his watch gleaming in the sunlight. He exuded confidence, success, everything Chris wanted for himself. Unable to stop himself, Chris approached the man. "Excuse me, sir," he said, swallowing his pride. "Can I ask what you do for a living?" The man glanced at him, then at the child clinging to his hand. Instead of brushing him off, he smiled. "I'm a stockbroker." Chris felt a jolt in his chest. "And you make good money doing that?" The man chuckled. "You have no idea." Chris watched as he walked away, slipping into a high-rise building with the kind of ease that came with belonging. At that moment, something shifted inside him. He didn't just want to be a stockbroker. He needed to be one. That was his way out, his path to a better life. Determination surged through him like never before. He didn't have a degree. He didn't have connections. But he had grit. And that had to count for something. From that day on, he made it his mission to break into the world of finance. He scoured libraries for books on the stock market, reading late into the night after Christopher Jr. had fallen asleep. He found free seminars, slipping into rooms filled with polished professionals who barely noticed him. He taught himself the language of stocks, the rhythms of Wall Street, the strategies of success. But knowledge alone wouldn't open doors. He needed someone to take a chance on him. Armed with nothing but sheer determination, Chris started cold-calling brokerage firms, pitching himself to anyone who would listen. Rejection became a daily ritual, but he refused to give up. He showed up at networking events uninvited, shaking hands with people who barely acknowledged him. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. And yet he kept going. Because deep down, he knew one opportunity was all he needed, one chance to prove that he was more than a struggling salesman, one break to rewrite his story, and he would stop at nothing until he got it. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows as Chris Gardner sat hunched over a battered finance book, his eyes scanning the pages despite the exhaustion weighing down his body. The shelter was eerily quiet, save for the occasional cough or restless shifting of the other occupants. Christopher Jr. lay beside him, curled up on a thin cot, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Chris ran a hand over his face, his fingers grazing the rough stubble that had grown unchecked. His days were a relentless cycle, waking before dawn, rushing to drop off his son at daycare, working menial jobs just to scrape together enough for food, and then spending every spare moment teaching himself the intricacies of the stock market. He had no degree, no fancy suit, no impressive resume, just an unwavering belief that he could be more than what life had handed him. The rejection was brutal. Firm after firm turned him away. His calls were met with curt refusals, or worse, complete indifference. He had perfected his pitch, learned to sound confident even when his stomach was empty, but nothing seemed to break the wall between him and the world of finance. Each rejection chipped away at him. The weight of his failures settled like lead in his chest as he stood in yet another food line, his son's small hand gripping his own. The humiliation burned deep. Waiting for a hot meal, avoiding the pitying gazes of strangers. He kept his head high for Christopher Jr., but inside, the doubt gnawed at him. One evening, after another day of fruitless calls, Chris sat on the floor of the subway bathroom, holding his son close as the world outside moved on without him. The cold tile pressed against his back, the stench of urine and disinfectant filling his nose. This wasn't how life was supposed to be. And yet, even here, in the depths of despair, he refused to let go of his dream. Then came the call. Chris nearly dropped the payphone when he heard the voice on the other end. Dean Witter, one of the firms he had been relentlessly pursuing. They wanted him to come in for an interview. Excitement and panic crashed over him in equal measure. He had no suit, no polished shoes, just the tattered clothes on his back. But none of that mattered. This was his shot. On the morning of the interview, he stood in front of the mirror at the shelter, trying to make himself look presentable. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed beyond repair, but his eyes burned with determination. As he walked into the gleaming office of Dean Witter, he felt the weight of 100 failures pressing down on him. The executives eyed him curiously, their expensive suits a stark contrast to his worn-out attire. But when he spoke, when he laid bare his hunger, his drive, his unwavering determination, they listened. They didn't see a homeless man. They saw a fighter. Against all odds, Chris was offered a spot in the firm's prestigious internship program, but the victory was short-lived. The internship was unpaid, and competition was brutal. He was surrounded by Ivy League graduates, young men with trust funds and connections, men who had never known hunger or desperation. Chris had more to prove than any of them. Days blurred into nights. He ran between work and daycare, often arriving at the office out of breath, his clothes still damp from the morning's frantic rush. He memorized stock reports on the bus, skipped meals to keep his son fed, and made more cold calls than anyone else in the program. There were nights he collapsed onto a cot in a shelter, his body aching from exhaustion, wondering if it was all worth it. He saw the doubt in people's eyes, heard the murmurs, "He'll never make it. He's just a charity case." But with every small victory, a client call that didn't end in rejection, a senior broker who took notice of his persistence, Chris pushed harder. Still, uncertainty loomed like a shadow. Would his sacrifices pay off? Or was he chasing a dream that would never be his? The office buzzed with quiet intensity as Chris Gardner flipped through his notes, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. The end of the internship loomed, and every moment felt like a race against time. He had done everything, worked harder than anyone else, made more calls, memorized more stock reports, but there were no guarantees. The haunting reality was that only a single spot existed for a full-time position. One. Out of all the interns, only one would be chosen. Chris swallowed the lump in his throat. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to walk away empty-handed. He needed this, not for himself, but for Christopher Jr. He had to prove that their struggles hadn't been for nothing. But life, as always, had one more test for him. Late one night, as he rushed into the shelter, his son nestled in his arms, he felt the heat radiating off the small boy's body. A deep cough racked through Christopher Jr.'s tiny frame, his face flushed with fever. Chris's heart pounded. Panic clawed at his throat. He spent the night nursing his son, pressing cool cloths against his forehead, whispering reassurances, though fear gnawed at him. Morning came too soon. His son was still weak, his breathing heavy, and Chris had a crucial meeting at Dean Witter, a final opportunity to prove himself. His mind warred against itself. He needed to go. He couldn't afford to miss it. But one look at Christopher Jr.'s face, his son, his entire world, made the decision for him. So, while the other interns sat in that boardroom, pitching their final cases, Chris was in a rundown clinic, rocking his fevered son in his arms. He tried not to think about what he was losing. By the time he returned to the office the next day, the whispers had already started. He had missed the meeting. The other interns gave him knowing looks, looks that said, "You're out." The realization struck like a hammer to his chest. Had it all been for nothing? That night, sitting on the edge of a stiff cot, Chris stared at the last few crumpled dollars in his hand. The weight of exhaustion, of endless struggle, pressed down on him. He had fought so hard, clawed his way through the impossible, and yet, maybe he had been foolish to believe. The payphone in the corner rang, a distant, hollow sound in the otherwise silent shelter. Chris barely registered it at first, lost in his despair. Then he heard his name. His legs felt heavy as he approached the phone, his pulse a thunderous drum in his ears. He picked up the receiver, his hand damp with sweat. "This is Chris." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The pause stretched, a breathless eternity. Then, the words that shattered everything. "Chris, we'd like to offer you a full-time position at Dean Witter." Silence. His mind struggled to process the words. The voice on the other end continued, but he barely heard it. A flood of emotions, relief, disbelief, overwhelming joy, swelled inside him, rising too fast to contain. His fingers tightened around the receiver. His chest ached with the sheer force of what this meant. He had done it. He had done it. Chris hung up, his body moving on instinct as he stumbled outside. The world seemed impossibly bright, sounds sharper, air crisper. Tears blurred his vision as he spotted Christopher Jr. playing with a worn toy near the shelter entrance. He scooped his son into his arms, holding him as tightly as he could. His voice cracked as he whispered into his son's ear, words thick with emotion. "We did it." And for the first time in years, he knew they were finally free. The moment Chris hung up the phone, the world shifted. The weight of uncertainty, of endless struggle, lifted just enough for him to take his first breath of true relief in years. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The next morning, he stepped into Dean Witter, no longer an intern fighting for a chance, but a man with a future. The suit on his back was still secondhand, his shoes still worn at the soles, but none of that mattered anymore. He belonged here. Christopher Jr. noticed the change first. His father no longer carried exhaustion like a permanent shadow. There was still struggle, long hours, endless responsibilities. But now, there was also certainty. There would be food on the table, there would be a home to go to, there would be peace. But success didn't erase hardship. Even with a full-time job, Chris found himself working tirelessly, competing in a world where connections mattered more than talent. He was still the underdog, the man who came from nothing, the one people underestimated. But he thrived in that position. He had spent years proving people wrong. Why stop now? He woke up before the sun, took the first train to work, stayed long after others had left. He studied the market obsessively, made bold moves when others hesitated, and slowly he climbed. Promotion after promotion, deal after deal, he carved his place in the financial world. But the biggest lesson he had learned wasn't about stocks or money, it was about resilience. Years later, Chris stood in a gleaming office looking out over the city skyline. The name on the door wasn't Dean Witter, it was Gardner, Rich and Company, his own firm. The dream he had barely dared to imagine while sleeping on shelter floors had become his reality. But more than wealth, more than success, what mattered most was the lesson he had taught his son. Christopher Jr. had grown up watching his father fight, fail, and rise again. He carried that same relentless spirit, that same refusal to quit. One evening, as they walked along the streets of Chicago, his son asked, "Dad, do you think you would have made it if you hadn't gotten that phone call?" Chris stopped, looking down at the boy who had been his anchor through the storm. "That phone call didn't change my life," he said quietly. "Everything I did before it did. Because in the end, success wasn't about luck. It was about showing up, even when the world gave you every reason to quit. It was about believing, even when no one else did. And it was about making sure that, when the moment finally came, you were ready to take it." If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Someone out there might need this inspiration today. Now, I want to ask you, what's the one call you've been too afraid to make? That call that could change everything? It's time to take action. Your turning point could be just one decision away. And if you love stories like this, don't stop here. Watch our next video on the top life-changing stories that might just inspire your next big move.